It is a wild morning, Christmas Eve day morning here at the Floating Funny Farm, and I thought I'd share a little sea story this morning as I wait for a lull before I begin my skiff journey to shore. If not for certain obligations, I might actually spend most of today just staying on board. In fact, I did tackle little shoe repair stitch work. I've also got a fuel fitting on the toolbox heater spare tank I need to get over to the workshop and redo. But mostly I just want to tell a story this morning. A story that came to me from a member of the greatest generation. A story that I think deserves to be passed on. Wait for a lull. It was many years ago. I was much younger. In my 20s, I guess. I was in a local boatyard doing my spring maintenance, and next to me in the yard was a plywood piver trimaran owned by a gentleman named Mr.Laffery. Never knew his first name, but he was a couple of generations ahead of me, and it never occurred to me that I needed to know his first name. He was just Mr. Laffery. And in the way that such things will happen in the boatyard in the spring, we got to talking, and he certainly had tales to tell. He was probably well into his 70s at that point, a member of the greatest generation, who'd gone off to save the world during World War II. But it was this one story that stuck with me and that I think of this morning as I sit here waiting for a break to hop in the skiff and go ashore. See, Mr. Laffery, he was in World War II, but I won't say he fought in World War II. I believe he was a Quaker. It's a pretty common, popular religious sect in this part of the country. This is kind of where it all started. And he was a Buzzards Bay small boat sailor from the time he was very young. Sailed with his father on the bay. And when the war came around, in World War II, if you were what we'd now call a conscientious objector, if your beliefs somehow forbade you from taking up arms, they found something else for you to do. In Mr. Laffery's case, he was an educated man. He, I think, had an engineering background. They trained him as a pilot, but not a fighter pilot, not a bomber, but a rescue pilot. Mr. Laffery's story just really reached down deep inside and stuck with me. It was probably his greatest life memory. I'm sure he's gone now, but in his honor, I'd like to preserve it here. So the story was that there was a downed plane somewhere, an aviator, somewhere in the Pacific, and Mr. Laffery was based, I believe he said, on a destroyer, which in World War II, destroyers typically carried float planes for reconnaissance and rescuing of downed aviators. Often these were World War I design vintage biplanes with floats attached to them. They could be craned over the side from the destroyer, take off, and go look for and hopefully rescue the downed aviator from his little life raft. So off he went to find this downed aviator that was reported. And as he flew, conditions worsened, and he began to wonder if he would even be able to land if he found the pilot. But find the pilot he did, and land he did, because that was his job. And he was part of a generation that understood the importance and the need for their job, regardless of what it was. So he landed and managed to get over to the aviator and get him aboard the biplane. Now, the old biplanes of World War I and World War II fairly commonly started using a blank cartridge shell that would be inserted generally in the cockpit of the plane, and the engine would be prepared for starting, the shell would be fired, the exploding gas of the shell would be directed into one of the cylinders, which would then turn the engine over, and hopefully it would catch and fire and start. The issue was that each of these planes had an ammo case under the seat with only a certain number of cartridges. You basically had a limited number of attempts to get your engine to start. So after Mr. Laffery got the aviator aboard and the conditions continued to worsen, he knew that he had a certain number of shots to get that engine to fire up and then to get the plane back in the air and return to the ship. Otherwise, both he and the aviator would be lost. And that gets to the crux of the story. You see, the conditions have been worsening and becoming less favorable for takeoff the entire time that he struggled to get the aviator onto his plane. And once he did, he had to choose very carefully his opportunity to take off between the building swells. And he said that's when it came back to him. His father had taught him, when sailing on Buzzards Bay, in often very gusty conditions, that if you were in a situation where missing stays was potentially life-threatening, remember now this being the period before World War II when auxiliary engines were still a rarity, then what you had to do was time your tack so as not to miss stays. You had to wait for a lull. And as Mr. Laffery sat in his seaplane in the middle of the Pacific in these conditions, his father's wisdom came back to him. And he said he could hear his father saying, "Wait for a lull." So they sat and waited, and when it looked like he had an opportunity between the swells to get his plane airborne, he fired off his first shell to start the engine. It sputtered, didn't catch. He had to wait for another lull. Fired his second and his third, each time waiting until he saw an opportunity to get airborne. And he said he got down to his last cartridge. And he waited for one more lull. And the engine caught. Sputtered, came to life. The lull lasted just long enough to get back in the air and get back to his ship. So maybe Mr. Laffery's lesson has wider implications. Maybe it's something we all need to think about from time to time. There are times when impetuosity is to our advantage, but in the great struggle of man versus nature, the smart struggler waits for a lull. And that's what I'm doing this morning. Thanks for coming aboard. Hope you enjoyed this yarn, and we'll see you next week.